The jelly roll, or JR bag. JR could of course be for jelly raiment. A jelly roll is a collection of 2.5-inch strips in coordinating colours that have been put together. They come in a quantity of strips. Sometimes you get 12, sometimes you get 20, etc, etc. And I decided to see what I could do with one and came up with this bag. The bag itself is extremely simple to construct. I've used the jelly roll for the handles and indeed for the actual bag itself. You can decide as to how deep a bag you have by simply sewing more or less strips together. And indeed, you don't need a jelly roll. You could just use any strips, or indeed, when you've seen the technique, a plain piece of fabric. The first thing to do is to sew your strips together to make a striped band. So choose how many strips you're going to be. I've got 9 for my particular bag, which is about 18 inches deep. When you've done the strips, I suggest you press the seams open and flat. And then fold the strip in half, level off the uneven ends. So I've left this end so you can see you're going to level off the uneven end. From that neatly levelled section, flip the fabric over if you're right-handed, bring a ruler in and measure off about 4 inches in from the end and cut a couple of strips. That's to make the handles. So you're going to have 2 strips to make the handles. You'll end up with one large piece of fabric, cut it in half. This will make a piece around about 16 to 17 inches. Now, I'm going to make a miniature version of the bag because there isn't enough room on the cutting mat. So let's pretend. Here are my 2 strips for handles that are 4 inches by whatever length of strips you've got, plus the front and the back of the bag. In addition to that, you'll want 2 pieces of lining exactly the same size as the front and the back. You'll need another piece of wadding. In fact, you'll need 2 pieces of wadding that will go inside the handle. So 2 pieces like this, round about 1.5 inches by about 18-19 inches long. And you'll want a couple of bits of wadding. The wadding just needs to be a little bit bigger than the front and the back of the bag. Move number 1 will be to take one piece of the bag, front or the back, it matters not, lay it onto the wadding, pin it onto the wadding on the 4 corners, and then sew all the way around the edge using a long stitch length, as I've done on this little sample, right the way round the edge. This is just to anchor the front of the bag to the wadding. I don't bother with any other quilting at all. I just stitch it to the wadding. When you've sewn around the outside edge, trim off any excess wadding back to exactly the bag itself. So get rid of all the rubbish. You now need to make the handles, and the handles are done in this particular fashion. I find it a very simple way to make the handles. Take your handle strip and press over about 1/4 inch along one long side. Fold the other one up by about 1/3. Repress it so this is in the middle. The fold is exactly in the center. Take your strip of wadding, pop the wadding inside. If it's not quite long enough, you can always give it a stretch. Fold over and pin this way at right angles to your stitching, because what you're then going to do is to sew down the center of the band. So several pins all the way in. Thread color can be whatever you happen to fancy. You will now sew down the center of the band, and I sew down the center of the band with the folded side upwards so I can see and make sure I hit the middle. I tend to use a wiggly stitch, but you could use any pattern you like. Just don't use one that's too fancy. You'll be there forever. When you've sewn down the center, sew up and down the sides with tram lines. So you'll have 2 handles, you'll have the front and the back of the bag on wadding, and it's going to be a bit like this. Handles got to be added by taking the handles and attach them to the top of the bag, making sure you have the right side of the handle to the right side of the bag. Stitch backwards and forwards a couple of times just across there to hold them in place. And then before you put the lining in, it's quite a good idea to pin the handle down a bit, just to stop it from twisting when we put the lining in place. Right, we're now ready to go to the machine and put the lining on. I'm now ready to sew the lining to the front of the 2 bag sections. So lay the lining on top, right sides together. We're only going to stitch along the top edge, the handle side. I've got the regular presser foot on the machine and I'm using needle in the middle. So it's slightly bigger than 1/4 inch seam allowance. Proceed all the way along in orderly fashion, right the way from one end to the other, and please use a regular stitch length. When you get to the end, take the next section, the next part of the bag, lay the lining along the handle edge. So off that one, onto the next one, you'll save some thread. Once you get to the end of your bag, cut the thread, obviously at the end, cut the thread in between the two sections, open them out. When you open them out, we're going to lay both bag pieces with right sides of the bag together, aligning them where the seam is between the lining and the top of the bag. So line up there. Push both seams towards the lining. Underneath the presser foot again, I suggest you pin it. I'm just doing this rapidly so you can see how the technique works. Proceed from the stitching there all the way down the bag. When you get to the corner, just do a fraction of a roundy corner. It just stops the bag sort of having nasty pointed edges. Along the bottom, up the other side again another roundy corner. Hopefully when you get to the top of the bag, you'll be able to match the seams up again. And this time go straight over the seam junction, down onto the lining. Now the lining always needs to be a bit shorter than the inside of the bag, than the outside of the bag rather, because it's going to go into the bag when you tuck it in. So stop, leave about 1/2 inch seam allowance on the bottom, turn the corner, sew along a little bit, because you don't want to have too big a hole to have to sew up afterwards. Cut the threads, flip the bag over, recommence again where you started the first time, and once more, slightly rounded corner, and leave a gap between the two sets of stitching. Once you've done that, I suggest you trim off any excess fabric on both the corners of the bag and off the lining. Tuck your hand into the inside of the bag, turn it through. Just be careful with those pins when you come to turn it through, because you'll get stabbed otherwise, so take them out. Once you've turned it through, the next and last thing to do is to tuck the lining into the bag. So push the lining in, tuck it in nice and neatly, poke the bottom of the bag out. It is easier with bigger bags, but we don't want to have too huge a bag or else the entire camera will be filled with the bag. Tuck the lining inside, poke the corners of the bag out, there we go. Tuck the lining inside, make sure it's neat and tidy. Then all I suggest you do then is to give it a good press around the top of the bag and top stitch. When it comes to top stitching, you're probably going to want to take the table off your machine, then you can use it as a free arm. So give it a good press and top stitch. And there you are, you have the JR bag. P.S. When you've turned the bag through, when you've pressed it, when you've top stitched all the way around the top there, don't forget to sew up the hole in the lining. Otherwise, you'll put your shopping in and wonder where on earth it's vanished.